Yeah. Hey, I remember. Good evening. I'm Suzanne Ellsbury, President of the League of Women Voters, Charlotte-Mecklenburg. We welcome all our League members and supporters this evening to our January League Talk. It's a virtual event held alternate months on third Tuesdays. If you're not a member of our organization yet, we invite you to join us. And by the way, students 16 years and up, your membership's free. So if you have a teenager 16 that might want to join us, Margaret House Soper is our membership chair, or you can get in touch with me. At this time, I'd like to recognize Sarah Basinger. Sarah's a board member and editor of our newsletter, The Voter, and she will give us some announcements of upcoming events. Sarah?
Thank you, Suzanne. Yeah, so everyone, I'm gonna drop things in the chat as I go if you're interested in signing up for any of the what I mentioned. But starting tomorrow night, Suzanne Ellsbury will represent the Education Action Team at the Mecklenburg Board of County Commissioners meeting. She'll speak during the budget public hearing on the fiscal year 2023-2024 about the value of public education. And the meeting will take place at the Government Center uptown, and members should consider attending to offer support. The public may also find a live stream of the meeting by clicking the link I'm going to drop in the chat. Then next week on Thursday, we're going to have the second meeting. The Education Committee again is hosting a second meeting about the CMS comprehensive plan. The revised plan is due out any day now. And again, our theme is equity and how the revised plan will improve educational opportunities for all students. So that we're running this meeting with our co-sponsors. We have 16 of our education advocacy partners, and this will give the public an opportunity to provide more feedback to the CMS staff about facilities, magnet programs, school boundaries, and the so I will drop that in the chat, the sign up. You can always go to Go League Go and find our events page, but I'm just I'm giving these links to make it easier. Also, January 31st at 7 p.m. will be our League Book Club. We'll meet to discuss The Chaos Machine, the inside story of how media rewired our minds and our world, by Max Fisher. Mr. Fisher is an investigative reporter with the New York Times, and he was a Pulitzer finalist for this book. This is his debut book. I'm dropping that in the chat. Then we have Civics 101 coming up in February. So that will run from February 1 to March 8th on consecutive Wednesday evenings. It's going to take place both in person and, or attendance is available both in person or via Zoom. And it's a great way to get insight into the structures of governance in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. For those that are new to this, the League, the city, or just want to, broaden their civics education. February 8th, we have the Lunch with the League at 11:30 a.m. And that's in person at the Myers Park Baptist Church. That will feature U.S. Attorney for the Western District of North Carolina, Dina J. King. She's a Charlotte native and has a massively impressive resume. And that should be a really interesting talk. I'm dropping that in the chat, and upon registration, you can indicate if you'd like to purchase a meal. There are some options there. Margaret House Sober just reminded that there's new member orientation is going to be on March 8th. Look for information about that. And then just our state convention for the League of Women Voters of North Carolina will take place in Charlotte from May 19th to the 21st, and sign up option will be available soon, and look for that in the voter and on our website as well. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Sarah. That was great. Well, we're a busy bunch, aren't we?
Yeah, we are.
This evening, we're so fortunate to have as our speaker, Dr. Michael Bitzer of Catawba College, and he'll be speaking to us about the results of the midterm elections with a particular focus on the judicial races. In addition, Dr. Bitzer will discuss the Moore v. Harper case currently before the U.S. Supreme Court. And lastly, we have asked him to give us his prediction of North Carolina's future, considering the predominance of the majority party and gerrymandered districts. Before introducing Dr. Bitzer, however, I'd like to recognize any elected officials in attendance. I see several. First of all, I see our former mayor and league member, Jennifer Roberts. Hi, Jennifer.
Howdy, howdy. Great to see everyone.
And I forgot to mention, Jennifer is also co-lead on the Carter Center Fair and Safe Elections with former North Carolina Justice Robert Orr. And they did an incredible job with the Carter. And I was
Professor Bitzer is on that group, and so are you.
Yes, yeah, big supporter. And you all will be carrying this into the next the 24 elections. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
All very secure. Let's see. Betty Chafin Rash is here. She's a life member. Hi, Betty. So glad to see you. And she was our former mayor pro tem in Charlotte. So Harry Taylor's here. He's the co-lead for the redistricting committee. Let's see. Mary Clens is here. Hi, Mary. Mary's a former league co-president, I believe, and she was co-president of the state board, league state board. So let's see, is there anybody else that I might have overlooked? We have a Rachel here. Is this Rachel Hunt, our representative? Rachel?
Hi, no, it's Rachel Nemechek. So just a member. Thank you.
Okay, all right. You never know who's going to show up. Are there any other elected officials or people that would like to be recognized? Or okay, then I'll recognize some of our board members. As Margaret House Soper's membership and environment, and her co-chair Margaret Fritz. Margaret is with the environment and sustainability, and Sarah, of course, you've met her. She's with the voter. Let's see who else is here. Linda Trum is a board member, and she's leading our new committee on DEI affinity and training. I think that's it. If there's anybody that I've forgotten, please let me know. Okay, then. Oh, we have some new members here tonight. Annette, would you like to give us a high five or something?
Hi, everyone.
Annette Gorlick, and let's see, who, Katie Grant, are you a new member?
I am. Hi, guys.
Welcome. Any other new members that want to just say hi? We won't embarrass you, I promise. We'll make you make a speech. Lakshmi Menon, right? Am I pronouncing it right? Welcome. Okay, without further ado, as I said, our this evening's speaker is Dr. Michael Bitzer, a professor of politics and history at Catawba College. Considered an expert in the field of political science, he's a much sought after speaker and analyst by local, state, and national media outlets. An author, his latest book published in 21 is entitled Redistricting and Gerrymandering in North Carolina, Battle Lines in the Tar Heel State. I am sure that many of you are probably also followers of his blog, Old North State Politics. At the conclusion of Dr. Bitzer's talk, we would like to hear from you. So please place your questions and comments in the chat box or raise your hand to be recognized. We also request that you keep your audios on mute during Dr. Bitzer's talk, and it looks like everybody's already complied with that. Dr. Bitzer, we are delighted and honored to have you with us this evening, and the virtual podium is now yours.
Well, thank you so much, and I always appreciate the kind invitations, and I'm truly honored to be with you all tonight. I'm going to share a, let's see if I can find here, do that, and share a PowerPoint here that I've got in terms of thinking about some general points about the 2022 midterm elections, talk a little bit about perhaps gazing into 2024. I will admit that my crystal ball got cracked in 2016, and I have not been able to find anybody to repair it. So if you're looking for definitive predictions, you might want to look at the bottom of a teacup or something like that. That's probably going to give you the best response in terms of thinking about an election that we have already started in 2024, already here in 2023. A couple of key points that I would like to make over this presentation. One of them is, what we saw in 2022 was indeed, for those of us who study elections and campaigns, a very historic midterm. And I'll talk more about that kind of nature of the historic dynamics of this midterm. I want to talk a little bit and give you a sense as to how I see the state's political dynamics in 2022. I'm very much somebody that looks at patterns, that tries to understand trends in various dynamics. I want to try and lead you through some of those dynamics and the trends and the patterns that I see in the state. And then talk a little bit about the polarization in North Carolina's politics. I think all of us recognize that we are indeed in polarized times in our politics, how we as political scientists think about that polarization, particularly in the state. So kind of giving you a sense as to what we saw in 2022, just as a kind of grounding and foundation. Typically, what we tend to see in the midterm since the end of World War II is that the White House, the party that controls the White House, will suffer, particularly in congressional seats. And this has been true 16 out of 18 midterms. So in general, what we tend to say is, if you tell me who controls the White House in the midterms, I'll say the opposition will probably have a very good evening and election in that regard. And generally what we tend to think about when it comes to midterms is indeed the role of economics. Now, in general, what we tend to know is that in terms of economics, it's usually unemployment that tends to drive the dynamics. But I think what we saw in 2022 was the historic rise of inflation, and that made the midterm elections pretty much serve as a referendum on the president's party. Whenever people are concerned about their wallets, their pocketbooks, that generally tends to play into the referendum idea when it comes to an election, especially a midterm election. And generally how we tend to look at this as a political science approach is pretty much the president's approval rating. What is the president's approval rating? What do we see in the past? What might that share for us in terms of trying to understand what we could see happen in the midterm election? Now, this is kind of getting a little bit of a political science, so just bear with me. But what you see on this chart is basically at the bottom, the presidential approval prior to the midterm election. So if a president is sitting at 70% or all the way down to 30%, whatever that range is, we then tend to look at the vertical axis and say how many congressional seats were either gained or lost by the president's party. You'll see 0 there at the top, down to a loss of 20, a loss of 40, a loss of 60 seats. If you take all of that data and look at each midterm election, what you will see is almost a kind of close relationship to how the president's approval rating matches up to how many seats are lost. You'll see at the top there, over the 0 line, George W. Bush in 2002 and Bill Clinton in 1998, they both gained congressional seats for their parties. Every other president, from Eisenhower in 1954 down to Harry Truman in 1946, down to Barack Obama in 2010, lost seats. And what we knew about Joe Biden's approval rating was that he was basically sitting in the low 40s, generally 43 to 44%. So if we took the past and tried to look at where Biden might fall in terms of the congressional seats lost, we were thinking somewhere in the bandwidth of losing 20 seats to 40 seats, something along the lines of 2018 and Donald Trump. Well, what turned out to be was actually a very historic, out of the ordinary result, with Joe Biden basically losing 9 congressional seats, picking up a US Senate seat. And so this really plays into the notion that this was kind of an outlier. This was a very historic dynamic. I think if you go and asked anybody, would Joe Biden lose less than 10 congressional seats, they would probably say, well, that may be a possibility, but it's stronger that it's probably going to be 20 to 40 seats. This is what we are talking about now in political science about this historic nature of the midterm election. What we also know out of this midterm election is a continuation over many election cycles of polarized partisanship driving how the voters are making their decisions. And in looking at the exit polls for both the national and here in North Carolina for the US Senate race, what I tend to look at is the party identification and how they voted for the respective parties. If you were a Democrat nationally, you voted overwhelmingly for your party, 96% for Democrats. Here in North Carolina, for Sherry Beasley, it was 97%. So we're matching national dynamics. If you said you were a Republican, again, 96% nationally. Here in North Carolina, 97% for Ted Budd. What we're all really interested in as political scientists is this growing block of independents. And typically in a midterm election, independents tend to break against the president's party. They tend to go for the opposition. This year, nationally and here in North Carolina, slight advantage to the Democrats. This is not a trend that we have seen in the past. So again, this kind of layers into the historic nature of this midterm election. 49% nationally going Democratic to 47. Here in North Carolina, 51 slightly more Democratic to 45 Republican. So that's kind of a brief overview of what I would describe as the historic nature of the 2022 midterm. Now I want to talk a little bit about the political dynamics of our state. There is a lot to talk about when it comes to these dynamics. But I think what I tend to look at are the two seminal modern elections in North Carolina's political history, and that is the 2008 and 2010 election. I describe North Carolina politics after these two elections as having sorted themselves. The voters have sorted themselves. The parties have sorted themselves. Everybody is within their respective tribe or camp when it comes to our politics. But what I've also noticed is that depending on how things have happened in the past, we can get a pretty strong indicator of potentially what might happen in the future. And as a political scientist, I study voter behavior and have found a pretty strong relationship to what an area has voted in the past and how it might be voting in a current or perhaps a future election. What I generally tend to do is, for my measurement, how I decipher this is to take the 2020 big three elections. So the US president, the US Senate race, and the North Carolina governor's race. 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat. That kind of represents the very bifurcated kind of dynamic that this state has seen in its politics, but it represents the historic competitiveness of this state's politics as well. Just to give you a sense as to what the past may tell us about the future, again, kind of looking at how on the bottom in 2016, the Republican presidential vote percentage was in each of the 100 counties in North Carolina, from 20% up to 80%. On the vertical axis, that's the 2020 Republican presidential vote. How closely aligned was how a county voted for a Republican in 2016 compared to how it voted in 2020, 4 years later? And what we see is what we would think to see is that as the 2016 percentage increases, so too should the 2020 percentage. And in fact, it does very nicely. For those of us in the math departments, the statistics geeks, this is a pretty close relationship in terms of describing 2016 as predictive of 2020's performance in each of the 100 counties. So taking the 2020 big three elections, president, US Senate, North Carolina governor, how did that, in terms of the 2020 numbers, how did that mirror or reflect how Ted Budd did in each of the 100 counties? So again, on the bottom, the big three in 2020, the vertical axis is Ted Budd's county percentage. And if you take that and scatter plot it or map it out, again, a very close relationship. 2020 tells us a lot about what happened in 2022 in the counties. But you can take this and do other elections with it. Again, looking at congressional districts, the Republican percentage of the big three in 2020 compared to how the Republicans did in 2022 in each of the congressional districts, a very close relationship. We're getting to almost 100% explanation for 2022 based on 2020 dynamics. And we can also see this down the ballot. In the North Carolina State Senate going into the election, we had 28 Republicans to 22 Democrats. Taking those big three numbers and looking at each district, I basically categorized all of the Senate districts, the 50 Senate districts, into strong partisans, strong Democrat, 14 districts, strong Republicans, 17 districts, all the way to the middle, where there were 10 competitive districts, 4 of them that leaned to the Republican, 6 of them that leaned to the Democratic. Now, if you take just the Republican districts, that would have created 26 districts, a majority for the Republicans, if you played out the 2020 elections. But they were aiming for supermajority status, 30. So they needed to win a number of the districts that were competitive but leaned Democratic. And what we ended up with, again, was a very close relationship. How 2020 performs and how 2022 played out is, again, a very close relationship. So what we ended up with was basically Democrats winning where they needed to be, but Republicans gained those crucial 4 seats in the competitive but lean Democratic districts. That's how they created their supermajority in the state Senate. To take the state House at the time, going into the election, 69 Republicans to 51 Democrats, again, spreading them out based on classifications. If you ran 2020's elections, those big 3 elections, it could have ended up as a 60-60 tie. It wouldn't have ended up that way because we knew the Republicans had some advantage going into the midterms that we thought would play itself out, where again they needed to make up towards their supermajority status of 72 would have been in the competitive but lean Democratic districts. And much like with the state Senate, again, a very close relationship. 2020 was able to predict 2022's elections very nicely. And so when what we ended up with was Democrats doing well in the strong districts, but Republicans were able to pick up in critical districts. 10 out of the 15 competitive but lean Democratic districts went Republican, and 1 likely Democratic district went Republican as well. That's 1 seat away from supermajority status in the North Carolina State House. So in this political dynamic, I'm looking at polarization in North Carolina politics. I actually teach a course on polarization in US politics, and I think we see a lot of similarities to what we are experiencing in North Carolina across the country. One of the key dynamics that I've become very interested in is geographic polarization. We are polarized based on where we live. And if you look at the statewide dynamics from both 2016 and 2020, we are very much a competitive state. 51-49, 52-48, if you take just the 2-party votes. But if you start to break down by the central cities, that means the Charlottes, the Raleighs, the Ashevilles, Winston-Salem, Wilmington, Fayetteville, we see an overwhelmingly Democratic dominance. In 2016, they went basically 2-1 Democratic. In 2020, it was basically 70-30 Democratic. In the urban suburbs, the areas that are outside of Charlotte, but inside Mecklenburg County, the Pinevilles, the Mint Hills, the Huntersville, the Corneliuses. In 2016, across North Carolina, they were the most competitive, 50-50. In 2020, they went 53-47. That's still competitive in a political scientist's mind, but nothing like the central cities. The third area of geography are the surrounding suburban counties, the Gastons, the Unions, the Iredales, the Cabarrus counties. They tend to play out as the most Republican areas of the state when you compare that to the rural counties that are basically 60-40. So while we have a truly competitive statewide dynamic, the only true competitive areas are those urban suburbs. Every place else is very much dominated by one party or the other. Along with geography, let's see. Oh, so this is the 2022 US Senate election results. Again, this is just the 2 parties. 52-48 for Budd over Beasley. But again, the patterns are going to hold the same. In the central cities, 70-30 Democratic. In the urban suburbs, 54-46 Republican. Surrounding suburban counties went even more Republican at 65. And the rural counties went much more Republican than they tended to be, 63-37. So again, this pattern is holding. The trend tends to hold over elections from 2016 to 2020 and now into 2022. Another form of polarization, generational dynamics. The country is confronting a real generational shift playing itself out. And we see that here in North Carolina. These are national numbers from the Pew Research Center that does a lot of survey of generational politics. The oldest voters, the silent voters, they tend to be highly competitive. 49 Republican self-identification to 48 Democratic. The boomer generation, same kind of dynamic, very competitive, 47 Republican, 46 Democratic. Gen X, the bridge generation, what I call, again, competitive party identification, 48 Democratic, 45 Republican. When you get into the millennial generation, basically those voters under the age of 42 nowadays, what we see is the tripartite partisan identification, independents rule, then Democrats, then Republicans. But if you ask the independents, pick one party over the other, what we are seeing is the widest partisan gap in identification of any generation that we have seen in modern American politics. And I think this kind of shift is playing itself out, certainly in North Carolina. And the way that I look at it here in this state is, what is the percentage in the precinct of each generational cohort? So the greatest, the oldest, the silent generation, the oldest voters, we think as that percentage increases in a precinct, the Republican percentage for the vote would increase in that precinct as well. And in fact, it does. We see the line going significantly up. So that tells me as the number of older voters in a precinct increases, so too does the Republican percentage. That's the greatest silent generation. Here's the boomer generation. Again, another upward slope. As the percentage of boomers increase in a precinct, so too does the Republican percentage of the big three. You take the Gen X percentage, not as steep of an increase in the line, but still it tells me as the percentage of Gen Xers increase in a precinct, so too does the Republican vote total. Now we get into the millennial generation, those voters basically age 26 to 42. How did they vote? Whoops, sorry. Their numbers are showing a downward trend line, which to me tells me as the percentage of millennials increases in a precinct, the Republican vote decreases. The newest generation, Generation Z, now basically 18 to 25-year-olds, are following millennials as well. As they increase, the Republican vote share goes down. So we're seeing a kind of tectonic plates rubbing up against each other, Gen Z and millennials against everybody else. But the key is turnout. And in 2020, statewide, we had 51% of the registered voters turn out. But for each generation, I was able to break it out. We see distinct differences. For the youngest generation, only 24% of them showed up. Millennials, 26 to 41, a little over a third of them showed up. When you hit Gen X to boomers and to the silent generation, they all met or significantly exceeded the statewide turnout rate. So this dynamic is very much at play here in North Carolina when it comes to generational politics. Finally, I want to talk about partisan polarization in terms of vote turnout and the vote method. What we have seen over time is basically how do the parties turn out at different rates versus unaffiliated. Now, this is going to give you quite a bit of information, but what you will see for each election year is a black bar chart, which is the statewide turnout, a blue one for Democratic Party registration turnout, the red for Republican registered voter turnout, and then the purple for unaffiliated turnout. And if you go from 2002 to 2020, you see distinct patterns. The state generally tends to be 47 in 2002, up to 64 in 2004, dropping down in the midterms. Again, it bounces up and down. But if you look at the registered Republican turnout, it is generally, with the exception of 2006 and 2008, significantly ahead of both the state and registered Democrats' turnout rates. So that's generally the benefit that Republicans have, is their increased voter turnout. Notice the purple lines, the last bars in each set of the dynamics, always significantly below. Registered unaffiliateds are now the largest group of registered voters in the state. They have the lowest turnout rate. And that again happened this year. 51% turnout rate. Republicans were at 58%. Registered Democrats slightly above the state at 51. Registered unaffiliateds 48%. So this pattern is continuing over time, over the past 20 years. And we not only see it in terms of the turnout rates, we can also compare it to the vote methods. In 2018, again, the state was basically at 51-49. This year, it was 52-48 Republican. But voting by mail in 2018, it was basically a Democratic 60-40 split. This past year, it was almost 3/4 Democratic. Absentee one-stop vote, the majority of votes coming before Election Day, was consistent. 53-47 4 years ago, 53-47 in 2022. On Election Day, more Republicans tend to show up, and they did so significantly in 2022 as well. So kind of the recapping the three key points, we saw a historic midterm. We saw inflation as the number one issue, but what really truly surprised a lot of us was how close the second most important issue was, and that was abortion. We thought the Dobbs decision in the middle of the summer would have an impact, but it felt like it was declining in importance as we got closer to November. That was not the case. What we are seeing more and more is political sorting going on in the country, and negative partisanship is really driving the dynamics of what we are now seeing as a very rigid, calcified electorate and body politic in our nation. I think of 2022 as basically a tale of two elections. Nationally, it was a good Democratic year. This was probably the best that the Democrats could hope for. In North Carolina, it was a good Republican year, particularly at the state legislature and with the two state Supreme Court seats going Republican as well. In terms of the political dynamics, the state continues to sort itself. The voters are very loyal, and the continuation of the partisan turnout trend means that this state is very calcified. It is very rigid, and we are very polarized. And the polarization is likely to continue. Geography, generational, voting methods, all of that points to the likely continuation of polarization in our state's politics. And with that, I will open up the opportunity for any questions and/or possible answers.
Right. You want them all in the chat?
A two-part question to kind of get us started off. In a report late last year, you wrote that the turnout in the North Carolina midterms was low, with only 51% of registered voters participating. And I'd like to know what you attribute this to. And the second part of my question is that in the same report, you wrote that the percentage of Republicans voting compared to Democrats was 58.4% Republican to 51.2% Democratic. Could this be attributed in part or wholly to the media's predictions about the red wave?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I think when it comes particularly to the turnout rate, you know, a lot of us, myself included, believed or thought that this was going to be a good Republican year. The midterms always move against the president's party. Republicans have done well in terms of energizing and mobilizing their particular groups. And I thought that, you know, the turnout rate might be a little bit higher than what we saw in 2018. Statewide in 2018, we saw a turnout rate of 53%. And that was without a US Senate race. That was a blue moon election. So all we had in 2018 were the US House races and then legislative races. I was thinking with a competitive US Senate race this year, that 53% was probably a threshold. That was probably the floor of a potential turnout rate. I was thinking mid 50s, maybe 56, 57%, because we have seen over the past couple of election cycles each year, the turnout rate move up and up. I was surprised by the fact that it was only 51% here in North Carolina. And I think while Democrats were able to meet the state average, if they want to truly be competitive, they need to start moving towards Republican level turnout rates because of the party loyalty dynamic. What I've talked about about 97, 98% self-identification for each party means that they are true party loyalists. And so I think, you know, in 2024, we should see a higher turnout rate. That always happens in presidential years. Will we hit 75% as we did in 2020? I honestly have no idea. But I think the patterns have been fairly consistent in pointing to one party having an advantage in turnout dynamics. What we could attribute that to, it certainly could be that idea that the Republicans are going to have a good year, so why should I show up if I'm a Democrat? To me, that really wasn't the case because they met the statewide average. It's just that Republicans had that higher turnout built-in advantage.
Speaking of turnout, the turnout for the under 40 age groups was 24% for the Gen Zs and 35% for the millennials. You seem to not find that disappointing. I did.
Oh no, I find it very disappointing. But I'm just reporting the numbers.
Oh, okay, okay. What, in your opinion, could be done to reverse that trend, if you call it a trend?
I would say the early indicators are indicating a trend. This has been now the third election cycle that I've kind of tracked this generational dynamic, and particularly millennials and now Gen Z. I was surprised that millennials aren't showing up at greater numbers because they are post-college. If they've gone to college, they're in their mid-20s. One would think that they are settling into professional careers. Some of them are old enough that maybe they are starting families. They're putting in roots into their community. And generally what we tend to know in political science research is once you start to settle, you become politically active, you become politically engaged. What we also know about this generation was they came of age in the Obama administration and the Obama era. And I would have thought that they would have had a slightly higher turnout rate than they did this year. I think that there's more study that needs to be done, particularly of millennial voters at this point in time. But as Charlie Cook, a political independent analyst, has said, no offense to anybody, but we're all pre-dead. Most of us, there are just some of us more pre-dead than others. And millennials and the Gen Z generation are going to be the replacement generations. And I think for particularly the political parties and the candidates who are running for political office, this is the future. And if we're not seeing a healthy turnout now, what will get them motivated, what will get them energized to show up to vote? I think certainly the personal attention, the going and door knocking, that kind of thing is what has worked in the past. But these are very different types of voters. The majority of them register unaffiliated. That's what's causing the rise of the unaffiliated voter in this state. So it's going to be interesting to watch and see the dynamic kind of play out, particularly with those two generational cohorts.
Thank you. That was a very helpful answer. We've got a question in the chat from Kelly Hofstadter. What feedback do you get from your students about voting or not voting?
Well, I have to say it first and foremost, I mostly teach major courses. So these are folks that are self-selecting into studying politics and political science. They all vote. They recognize the importance of civic participation. But most importantly, when I ask them, is anybody thinking about running for political office? The past couple of years, I have gotten 0 hands raised. They are the children of polarized politics. They know nothing other than politicians basically screaming at each other, calling each other nasty names, this kind of negative, intense polarization playing itself out. What they want to do is public service, but not necessarily through running for office. And while I commend them for wanting to be engaged in our civic life through either working in government or being an advocate or some other kind of public service activity, I say we need good people to run for political office. And it I think is going to take some convincing. We do have a number of younger elected officials nowadays, both locally in the state and nationally, but we are really confronting a kind of generational dynamic that I don't blame them in any way, shape, or form because of what they have seen in our politics writ large. But I do encourage them to say, you need to be part of the process. You need to be part of our civic engagement. And that may mean running for political office. I hope that trend turns around. I have to say, I've got a very small group that I survey. So I'm not sure that they may necessarily be indicative of the generations at large. But they are confronting some real issues and real dynamics that as a political scientist, I'm concerned, but I see positive aspects playing itself through as well.
That's good to hear, because I was just thinking we've not provided a good model, evidently, for them to feel this way. There's another question in the chat, Mary Cleanse. She would like you to talk about your concept of the quote, unmoored voter.
That's a great question. So, and I have to say, I'm not the only one who came up with this. It has been a joint research project with Susan Roberts at Davidson College, Chris Cooper at Western Carolina, and Whitney Ross Manzo at Meredith University. The 4 of us are very much engaged in trying to understand North Carolina politics, and we've been wanting to try and understand the rise of the unaffiliated voter, now the largest block of registered voters. And what we've done is some research to kind of look at how unaffiliated voters have participated in party primaries. Unaffiliateds can vote in either the Democratic or the Republican primary here in North Carolina. And so we have taken a lot of data and records from the State Board of Elections and looked at all of the unaffiliateds that have voted in the past couple of primary elections to see how they break down. And what we found was a little over half of them are what we call shadow partisans. They're registered unaffiliated, but they consistently voted in 4 party primaries for the same political party. Another healthy chunk, about 47% of those unaffiliated voters, bounced literally back and forth. And it was oftentimes based on which political party had the most competitive primary going on. So what we do is we describe those bouncers, those kind of floaters, as the unmoored voter, somebody who may be home within one political party, but if there's a competitive primary in the opposition, they'll bounce over and try to influence that particular party primary. And it's something that we in political science have done a lot of research about independent voters, but we haven't gotten down into this kind of data analysis. And that's what I think is something that we're contributing to understanding who's registering as unaffiliated. Are they truly independent voters? Some are. Most likely, they're more closet or shadow partisans using that unaffiliated status to kind of mask the partisan labels.
Oh, thank you. Because this is another question from the chat, I believe it's Kevin Woodson, KW. Because we live in a hyper-connected world, does a nonstop request for money lend the younger generations to move towards nonpartisanship?
Boy, that is a great question. And as many times as I've tried to excise myself from candidate emails, I'm just barraged from all sides on this. That is something I have not thought about, to be honest. I think certainly the constant contact that candidates do, even after they win election, usually it's about a week or so later, they'll start emailing you. You know, I've got to start raising money for 2 years from now, or 4 years from now, or 6 years from now. And, you know, can you chip in $5? Well, that may not seem like a lot, but once they get you hooked. And I'll have to ask my students if they try and unsubscribe from those emails. You know, as I talk to them about it, you know, I always say, you know, money is the mother's milk of politics. You got to have the money in order to run things. But the constant kind of contact between the candidates and donors is something that really political scientists need to look a little bit more deeply into. I'm just not aware of any kind of real answer to that question, so I apologize for it. But I think that there may be a hint of something there, but I would love to see some research on it.
Well, that kind of leads to the question that what do you think about like government-funded campaigning? And then everybody would be on an equal financial footing.
Yeah, we tried that particularly with the presidential contest, and then one candidate in 2008 said, you know what, I'm not going to go with the guaranteed money. I'm going to try to raise it all on my own. And that was Barack Obama in 2008. And it's basically just blown that out of the water. I think this power of the internet, particularly to reach small donors, and some candidates thrive on the small donor dynamic as opposed to the big donor dynamic. It has really reshaped how we look at campaign financing in this modern age. And I think when people feel engaged, they do that kind of small donor donations, maybe start ramping up. They may not hit the limit per se of each campaign cycle, but with the technology that we have nowadays and the multiple ways of reaching voters, this small donor dynamic, I don't think is going away anytime soon.
Thank you. I'm afraid I agree with you. I know that you didn't touch on this in your presentation, but I would like to ask you about it because it's a timely thing. A lot of us are concerned about it. The Moore versus Harper case
Sure.
that's currently before the U.S. Supreme Court. I get the feeling that if this happens, we would see a radical reshaping of our justice system and electoral system. Justices Alito, Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh has expressed some interest, have indicated their support for this independent state legislature theory. Do you have a prediction of the probable decision? Would it be a minimalist interpretation, or do you think it might be more narrow?
Again, with all preface of my cracked crystal ball, I will say that up front. I did listen to the oral arguments, and even as somebody who teaches about the court and who teaches constitutional law, there were times that I was completely lost, and they were deep into the weeds about this particular issue. Looking back on it and kind of rereading back through the transcript of the oral arguments themselves, I think certainly the court seems to be somewhat splintered. I think certainly the three most conservative justices, Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch, were very much on the side of, we are fully supportive of this, in all practicality, novel approach to how state governments should operate, because that's what it is. It's an argument about how state governments divide up their governing power and influence. I think the three liberals on the other side, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, were very much, against this particular theory. Kavanaugh presents an interesting dynamic, but more importantly, I think Chief Justice Roberts and potentially Justice Barrett may be the deciding votes on this one, because, as you indicated, I think that they are going to try to find a very narrow thread to push a particular majority opinion through. Now, if that happens, if that kind of division plays out, it's a 3-3-3 split. And somebody will need to move one way or the other in order to create a kind of plurality majority opinion to be the controlling opinion on this. What I see happening is a potential narrow, but if a state has specific constitutional provisions, the state constitution should be interpreted in that dynamic. And I think here in North Carolina, particularly with the past decisions on especially redistricting, Chief Justice Newby, who is now in the majority with a Republican majority, has basically said independent state legislature theory is how North Carolina has operated when it comes to redistricting. Now, the potential dynamic nationwide of this is that if states have turned over, say, independent to independent commissions, or perhaps courts have intervened, like in New York, to say too much Democratic redistricting towards gerrymandering is unconstitutional. If the U.S. Supreme Court moves in such a manner to promote or enhance the legislatures, the state legislatures' power in all this, be careful what you wish for, because states like New York and other states could push the envelope to redistrict for Democratic advantage, just as North Carolina could push it for Republican advantage. So we could see all-out nuclear war when it comes to redistricting, and whoever controls legislatures could push the redistricting and gerrymandering dynamics to potentially benefit both sides. It would just be epic wipeouts in a lot of states, but then all combined could result in kind of the competitiveness that we see in the U.S. House of Representatives at this time.
I've also read that we'd have to throw out a ton of precedents, and
Yeah.
wouldn't that just be chaos?
Well, and that is something that in general, and I say in general, someone like Chief Justice Roberts is loath to do. It has happened. The Dobbs decision was a significant overturning of precedent. Chief Justice Roberts wrote a dissent in the Arizona Redistricting Commission case that said legislature means legislature, the body, but he was in the minority. It was a dissent. The majority upheld the power of the legislature, and particularly the voters, to turn over legislative power to an independent redistricting commission. He would basically need to overturn that precedent that he disagreed with, but upholds the idea of precedent at the same time. So there's a lot of moving parts, but you're right. I think that this particular decision will have significant consequences for American politics. It's not just about North Carolina. It is truly national politics at play in this particular decision.
Agreed. Thank you. Yeah, it's very complicated. Just
Yes.
Tom Bowers has a question in the chat. Isn't the originalist theory contradictory to the founding fathers' provisions for unpredictable future issues?
Originalism, as I remind my students, did not start with the founding framers, but was actually begun in the late 60s into the early 1970s. So, you know, it is a fairly new kind of legal theory. You know, the question becomes, can you truly decipher what people were thinking, especially if they didn't leave anything written? And while we can understand how words were used 200 plus years ago, the lack of true understanding as to what the framers were thinking at the time, and the incomplete nature of the notes, particularly from Madison, who later on went back and revised a lot of his own notes, leads us to question whether we can truly find the original intent in constitutional law. And that's one of the dynamics that I pose to my students whenever I present them with case questions, or more horrifically, final exam questions.
Right. Jenny Sullivan has a question in the chat related to the House of Representatives. Since there are only 20 rogue Republicans, how much can they really affect votes? And of course, this is a national question. We'll switch over.
Yeah, and I'm happy. I saw a comment earlier about just restricting it in North Carolina. I'm happy to try and answer any broader national questions. I've been thinking a lot about this since the week-long speakers election and what ultimately came out of that. I think we have three political parties in the U.S. House of Representatives. We have the Democrats, we have about 202 Republicans, and we have the 20 rogue Republicans, the chaos conference, as what I've heard them described as. It only takes 4 out of that 20 to basically deny the speaker any action on the floor. And as things played out, it was basically a battle of wills during that speaker fight. And when it came down to it, it was basically 6 individuals that will hold Speaker McCarthy his feet to the fire. And if they don't get what they want, they are more than willing to withhold their vote. And I know that we are in divided government, and I teach about gridlock, but this particular situation over the next 2 years, let alone in the next several months, particularly with the debt ceiling issue that is coming forward, this has some real potential to be constitutionally catastrophic. If things don't get done, this has some real ramifications that will impact not just Washington, D.C., but potentially the nation's economy and potentially the world's economy. There are some real critical issues moving forward that if that group holds that much power, we could be in for some very long evenings of voting situations and trying to get something passed in the U.S. House of Representatives, let alone trying to get it then passed into the Senate and to get the president's assent to it as well.
Back to North Carolina, the dominant party in North Carolina legislated a gubernatorial veto in all cases except redistricting. How can this be interpreted as anything but support for one party rule?
Well, what's a little known fact is the author of the gubernatorial veto that expressly excluded, there were a number of things, but the most prominent one was redistricting legislation. When that legislation was proposed to give the governor the veto power, the state senator that proposed that was very clear to say he did not want the governor involved because this was the legislature's predominance. I dare say that if Governor Roy Cooper could go back and speak to State Senator Roy Cooper, he might have something a little different to say, because it was indeed Governor Cooper who proposed and pushed through that gubernatorial veto legislation that excluded redistricting from it. You know, we are a historically legislative supremacy state that harkens back to royal governors and the abuse that royal governors did on state colonial politics and government at the time. And the legislature has always seen itself as the dominant superior branch in our state's dynamic of separating power amongst three different branches of government. So I think with the redistricting dynamic at play, and we will see that come up in this year's legislative session, not just for Congress, not just for state Senate, as the state Supreme Court handed down their decision, I would not be surprised if the state House map was also redrawn, particularly based on how Moore v. Harper comes out. So we could see yet again a very clear shift in terms of the redistricting dynamic and the gerrymandering dynamic. Part of that is due to the voters having sorted themselves into communities, into precincts that tend to vote overwhelmingly for one party over the other. And yes, lines matter, but we, the voters, have done a lot of the sorting for the map makers ourselves.
So there's a lot riding on that Supreme Court case.
There is, yes, both within the state and nationally. Yes.
Another question from the chat from Mary. Dr. Bitzer, in your opinion, what is the state of democracy today and in the near future?
We in political science, particularly those of us that study American politics, have had to learn the idea of democratic backsliding. And when I use the term democratic or democracy, I'm talking about small d democracy, the basic ideals, the basic concepts of what our system of governance is based on. Before 2022, coming out of 2020's election, and particularly with January 6th, 2021, I was very concerned, not just as a political scientist, but as an American citizen, about the power and the ability of democratic backsliding and the rise of authoritarian politics in our nation. We have seen that from time to time play itself out in our country. But in this modern context, this was something that a lot of us who study American politics, who look to our colleagues who teach in international politics or comparative politics, to try and help us understand what we were doing to ourselves. I think if you had seen more candidates, particularly for secretaries of state, be elected who denied the 2020 election, I would be much more concerned. I'm not as concerned as I was right after January 6th, but the potential is still there. It is very evident to me that we could continue to see that democratic backsliding happen if we are not careful, if we are not diligent, and if we do not, put forth the effort to keep this grand experiment in we, the people governing ourselves, alive. Once you give up political power willingly, it is oftentimes extremely difficult to get it back without violence associated with it.
Good point. Leaving this and kind of going to another subject on voting processes. The League supports eliminating the Electoral College and favors the national popular vote. What is your opinion on the elimination of the Electoral College? And could you also give us your opinion on the national popular vote and maybe ranked choice voting for national elections?
Sure, great questions. In fact, talked about the Electoral College dynamic today in my presidency class. The Electoral College was, some would argue, founded as one of our checks and balances in the process of electing a president, that independent leaders within the various states would be a check on the masses. And what that basically turned into was, with the advent of political parties, the locking in of electors to one political party over the other. And so that natural checks and balance really kind of got warped with the rise of political parties. I think certainly, the issue continuously, we've seen it in 2000, saw it in 2016. The repeat of the Electoral College winner not matching up to the popular vote winner always calls that into question. The biggest hurdle that you're going to have to try and move towards popular vote totals, the Constitution itself. It requires a constitutional amendment, and getting that through Congress, then getting the requisite number of states to ratify it is difficult. We are one of few constitutions that have seen very little change. 27 amendments are a lot, but in the grand scheme of things for written documents, we are one of the very few changed constitutions throughout the number of years that it's been in operation. I think ranked choice voting is really an opportunity for Americans to use the dynamic of, well, I want the winner to have a majority of the vote. And what we see with ranked choice voting, it does take longer. The Alaska utilized that for a number of races. This past year, it took a while to figure out the winner in all of it. we unfortunately in this day and age have an excruciatingly short attention span, and we want everything instantaneously. As soon as the polls close at 7:30, who wins? Well, you ain't going to get that. I'm sorry. That's just not the dynamic that we have. And, think back to the early founding, to the early period of the Republic, when we had to wait for horses to carry information.
Pony Express.
Who won?
Yeah.
So, I always tell people, just relax, chill out. We'll find out who wins. But, sometimes people get hung up on ranked choice voting of, what do I do with the second round and what do I do with the third round? If you explain it to people in kind of very simple terms and use examples, they understand that it's all in the guise of getting the winner to a point of 50% plus one, so that they can say a majority voted for this candidate as opposed to maybe a majority voted against this candidate. And that's the kind of democratic dynamic.
Right, thank you. My understanding with the national popular vote that it's a workaround for getting, the electoral college eliminated, which would take a constitutional amendment. Yeah. My understanding is with the national popular vote, it wouldn't require a constitutional amendment.
There are some that say that there would be, I suspect, and this is just my personal professional belief, I would suspect that there would be legal challenges to that, and to say, we have in the Constitution a written set of rules. If you try and circumvent that, that's going around the written set of rules that we have. You don't like it, change the rules, but put the rules into effect in the governing document. How that's going to play out, again, cracked crystal ball. So
I'm sorry about your crystal ball. Let's see, there was a comment, and now I've lost it, that somebody thanked the speaker. Appreciated having you here, but I can't pull it up. Tom Bowers has another question. Some states have proportional voting, not winner take all. What would that do if nationalized? Of course, it's just for the presidential and vice presidential candidates, this national popular vote.
Yeah, I don't. So are you? I'm not sure I'm clear about it. The proportional, would that be proportional to the electoral votes for each state, or?
Tom, you want to explain your question?
It seems to me that winner take all is very undemocratic, and that everyone who is in a minority, their vote automatically is discounted. When in fact, if each state had a proportional number of electors based on the proportion of the vote, that we would reflect a better outcome.
Understand. Okay, now I understand. All right. So yes, we in 48 states, it is winner take all, based on the principle of first past the post. So if I get one more vote than you get, Tom, in a state, I get all of the electoral votes. And it doesn't matter if I'm in a majority or if I've got a minority vote. So if I get 48% and you get 47.9% and I'm the top vote getter, I get everything, even though a majority didn't vote for me. In two states, Nebraska and Maine, they award the electors based on the House numbers to congressional districts. Now, some would argue that with the power of gerrymandering, that automatically skews those electoral numbers to benefit one party over the other. In terms of proportional representation within the electors themselves, it is a possibility. We could certainly rewrite the rules of the game for that dynamic. I can see, shall we say, the courts getting involved to make a determination. We've got 15 electoral votes here in North Carolina. Is that, who's going to get, if it's 51-49, is it are we doing 8-6? What would be 8-7 in that regard? Or would somebody try and fight over the percentage of that one electoral vote in terms of the percentages? It is a confusing way that we do it currently, that a lot of people don't understand with the Electoral College. Trying to find that compromise of representation, but proportionality can be a challenge as well.
Thank you. I'm looking for some more questions in the chat. We skipped any.
I hope I haven't gone over time. I don't know how late y'all go.
I think we've strained your generosity, keeping you talking all this time. But does anybody have any questions that they want to raise their hand and ask? And if not, we'll let Dr. Bitzer rest. Okay, apparently not. Thank you, everybody, for coming and your wonderful questions and participation. Yay, you're getting a hand. And we hope you'll come back soon and give us some more of your wisdom and analysis and information from your cracked crystal ball. Oh, Margaret.
Happy to do that.
Margaret has a question. She's got her hand raised. Margaret, you want to unmute? I think
Nope.
Margaret had her hand raised. Okay, well, we'll do it next time. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We really appreciate it, and have a good night.
Thank you. Everybody have a good night as well.
Thank you.